Alright, welcome to another KeyShot 5 webinar. My name is Rex Roberts, and I'm a digital media artist here at Luxion. I'm very excited to share with you today the brand new release of KeyShot 5. This will be an intermediate level webinar for those familiar with using KeyShot in the past. I'll be going over some of the changes you'll notice in the application, along with the new features and functionality that make KeyShot 5 more powerful, faster, and easier to use. If we head over to keyshot.com and navigate to the What's New page, you can see an outline of these features, as well as a What's New guide that goes into more detail of how each of the features works. So as you can see here, we've broken down the improvements in KeyShot 5 into 4 categories. One is the streamlined interface. 2 is the enhanced rendering speed. We also have powerful new animation tools and advanced pro features. And this will also be the structure of today's webinar. So let's go ahead and get started by taking a look at some of the new interface components. So when we first launched KeyShot 5, you may notice a few new things here in the interface. Let's just close up some of our windows here. We'll close the timeline, the project, and the library for now. So you can see the new KeyShot 5 welcome screen, and this gives you immediate access to the newsletter, some learning links and video tutorials, and your most recently opened documents. So you can quickly access and open up your BIP files. Okay, so you should all be familiar with the toolbar. Back in KeyShot 4, we had a similar configuration, but we have changed things a little bit here. We now have the KeyShot Cloud to the far left of your toolbar. And this is our online library of resources where you can upload and share as well as download to use directly in your scene. And just like the other windows in KeyShot, this can be docked in multiple locations, but we'll close this for now and come back to it a little later. So yeah, just like those dialog windows, the toolbar itself can also be torn off and docked in a variety of locations, so you can find what works best for your workflow. As we move through the toolbar, we have our import button. There have been some changes here, so if I import a file, you can see we have a little different dialog here. Depending on what type of file you're importing, you might see some different options here, but you can see we've added these accordions, and the state of these accordions is remembered every time you close and reopen KeyShot. So we'll get back to this later on in the webinar when I import a model. We have our library and project. You can see there are some small arrows here, so if you click and hold, that is the flyout, and you can navigate quickly to a particular tab in each of those dialog windows. Let's open up our project as well. You may notice that now we have the option to dock the library and project side by side. In the past, we had only the ability to dock them on either side of the real-time view, and then also in a tabbed format on top of each other. But now, like I said, we have the option to dock side by side as well as stacked one on top of the other. I prefer to use them side by side, so I have quick access to my in-project material library, and I can quickly either save materials by dragging and dropping into a folder, or I can apply materials from my library by dragging and dropping onto one of these thumbnails or into my scene tree. Also here we have some new tabs. We have icons in the tabs. We also have the option to show the text. If you right click, you can show the text and resize to refresh that. All depends on your personal workflow preference. But I find the less clutter the better. And once you find out, or once you learn what these icons represent, then it's pretty easy to navigate through those tabs. Okay, we have our animation window. I'll come back to this later when I talk about the new animation features. We have our render window. There is a new option here for performance. I'll get into that later. And then we have our screenshot button. We've moved the KeyShot VR up into the ribbon here. So why don't I talk about the ribbon a little bit. This gives you quick access to some commonly used commands and functions. So we have the option to select the number of cores that the real-time window is using. So for the purposes of this webinar, I'll bring my cores down to free up some space for the GoToMeeting application, or for your Creative Suite or your CAD application. If you're running another application simultaneously, this is a good feature to use. We also have the pause button here in the ribbon now, so you can use the hotkey Shift P or use the pause button. We have scene sets, so we can toggle through our scene sets. I'll talk about that later. Toggle through our saved cameras or view sets. We can lock our current camera. We have some camera movement modes, and these are brand new and made to enhance the experience when using a laptop. So if you don't have a mouse, if you don't have a middle mouse wheel, then you can use these commands to not only tumble, but pan and also dolly, and that's all using the left mouse button. We have a quick perspective adjustment slider, access to material templates, your HDRI Editor, NURBS mode, performance mode, and again your KeyShot VR wizard. So depending on what version of KeyShot you have, whether it's HD or Pro, you might not have all of these options here. Okay, and then above the ribbon we have the menu bar. We've also enhanced this by reorganizing some of the items in here, making sure everything is in a logical order. We've also added some new features here, such as the 3D print export, which I'll get to later. Under the edit menu, something that's very helpful is the new add geometry commands. So these are quick one-click commands to import primitive geometry or ground plane materials and geometry into your scene. You can also set the scene units here. So we do have some scene units applied to our scene, but if we were to change this, you can see we now have a couple options either for convert or correlate. We'll cancel this and continue through the menu items. Our environment options. We have our camera settings, including the new match backplate feature, which I'll talk about later when we talk about some pro features. Under the render menu, we have quick access to add to queue. This can be very helpful when used in combinations with scene sets or view sets, quickly toggling through those and adding each configuration or variation to your render queue to render out at a later time. We have all the settings that you'll find in your settings tab, including motion blur, which I'll talk about later when we talk about animation. some view options. We've added a couple hotkeys, such as a hotkey for the coordinate legend. We can show our heads-up display, which displays your frames per second. So in KeyShot 5, you'll notice this frames per second number should be a little over 2 times as large or as fast as KeyShot 4. So we have some great improvements in performance, and I'll talk about that a little later as well. Okay, under the window, we have the option to show and hide some of our windows and our ribbon and our toolbar. And then we also have a style sheet editor here. So if anybody knows how to use Qt and would like to customize the look and the feel of their KeyShot version, they can do so here and save out a copy. And if you do create something cool, please share it on our forum, and we'd love to take a look at it. And then under the help menu, we have our updated manual, updated hotkeys list, some links to learning tutorials, registering your license, etc. Okay, so that was the Streamlined interface. I talked about the welcome screen, the toolbar, the brand new ribbon, the updated menu, the ability to dock your library and project in different locations, some options with the tabs, and then the new accordions that are within each of the dialogues. So now that we looked at that, let's take a look at some of the new features that help speed up your rendering and your workflow as well. Okay, so for this part of the webinar, I'd like to demonstrate using one of the new demo scenes that comes with the full installer of KeyShot 5. So on the Windows machine here, I can go to my Documents, KeyShot 5, and my Scenes folder. And I can find my KeyShot 5 material ball, and I will just open that file up. Okay. I'll go ahead and unlock my camera and unlock the aspect so I can take full advantage of my real-time view space here. And we won't need a ground plane in this case. So I'll go ahead and delete that. And so what I want to do is just show you how I use the pattern tool to create an array of these material balls. And I'll go ahead and apply some of the new procedural textures to these guys. So let's go ahead and do that. I'll just change my background color to a solid white. And to pattern, we can select the top level group or model in our scene tree and right click, and then you can see the option for pattern. Now if we were to do this on the part level, we do not have that option. So pattern is only available for top level groups or models, but because we do have grouping, we can just move this part level to a top level group if we did desire. So let's go ahead and open up our pattern tool. There actually is a difference between duplicate and pattern. Duplicates do not update using update geometry or live linking, while patterns are instances referring to the original model. So if you create a pattern of multiple instances, then each of these models will update if you change the geometry in your CAD software and use the update geometry option on import. Okay, so in the pattern tool we have the option for a linear or a circular pattern. In this case I'll use a linear pattern and adjust the spacing in between the instances. want something like this, so we'll go ahead and rotate. And then we have the option to center and resize the environment. So the original material ball here is obviously not in the center of our array. So checking this center option will make sure that this group of instances or this array is in the center of our environment. And then as this array grows larger, the environment will also resize to fit our models here. So we'll keep both of these checked. And we'll say OK. Alright, so now we have our array of material balls. Let's go ahead and apply some of our new procedural textures. Now we do have some of these already created in the library, and we can either browse or search for some of them and go ahead and apply them. So I know that we have a couple cloth weave materials. Those are actually in the cloth and leather folder. So we can quickly drag and drop those on here. So again, that is the cloth weave. We also have a fiber weave. So that is the carbon fiber gloss material. We have some metal materials with procedural textures. So we have some brushed materials. All of the brushed materials in the full installer for KeyShot 5 have been updated to procedural textures and no longer use the traditional texture maps anymore. So we can grab one of these guys. We also have a scratches material, or a scratched material. And we'll want to bring down the scale of that. So if we double click to edit the material, go to our textures tab, you can see we have the scratches procedural type applied to this material as a bump. And we can just bring our scale down to something a little more reasonable. So from this texture type drop down, you can see all of the procedural types. Some are not available, or depending on which texture you have selected, some might not be available. So if we go over to color, you can see we have a couple more for color gradient and curvature. So let's go ahead and add a curvature procedural to this ball back here. We'll change this to a tune material and add a color texture as curvature. So what curvature does is it defines the level of curvature in your part and assigns a different color to those, whether it's a negative, a 0, or positive curvature. So using a tune material, I'm going to use this curvature procedural to kind of create a cell shaded look for this material ball back here. So for the 0 color, I'll set this as my base color. And for the negative curvature, I'll have this represent kind of the darker shadowed areas, and my positive curvature will be the white highlighted areas. Then we can just go ahead and kind of play around with our sliders here and our parameters to find what works best for our particular case here. Okay. Let's see. We have two different types of procedural groupings. We have 3D procedural types and 2D procedural types. So the 2D types are similar to your traditional texture maps, So you can see that here with this brushed material, we actually have some seams, and that is because this texture has been box mapped. So if we click on the position drop down, we can see we can choose between the different projection types for this material. So unlike the 3D texture, the 3D procedural textures, the 2D types such as brushed, cloth weave, and fiber weave, they don't necessarily wrap perfectly around some of these edges, as you can see with these seams here, but we do have the flexibility to make interactive adjustments and see all of those adjustments updating in real time. So those are the 2D procedural types. For the 3D types, we have Cellular, which I have not yet applied, so let's find one of those, and that would be the hammered type materials that we have. We already have some created here in the library. I'll reduce the scale on this guy as well. So then for the Cellular, you can see there are no seam lines, and these 3D types wrap very smoothly around complex edges and corners. So the 3D types are, like I said, the Cellular, the curvature, which I've already showed you, scratches, which we've applied here, and the last type is the color gradient. So let's go ahead and apply a color gradient to our two last balls here. So let's say we change this to a metal, go to our Textures tab and select Color Gradient, and we're automatically given this default color gradient, and this is a linear type, but we can change this to spherical, open up our mapping tool and use position to select where we want the center of that gradient to be. We'll say OK. We can increase the scale and adjust some of our location values here to find what works best for this particular piece of geometry. Okay, let's go ahead and change out these colors. Turn this to, let's say I want this to be like a green, and the outside will be a purple. And then I'm going to copy this material by pressing Shift left click, and I'll paste a copy of this material by pressing Shift Control left click. Make sure that material is unlinked, and we can just change the colors on this to, let's make this a yellow with the outside as a red. Okay, so these are the 7 different procedural texture types that we've added in KeyShot 5. Now we've created some custom materials, so let's go ahead and save these and upload them to the KeyShot Cloud. So I can just select a folder that I've already created, or I can create a new folder, find my material that I've created, and we'll call this Fire Iridium. This is a similar type of material that is used in sunglass lenses. You can see these types of gradients, these metallic gradients, are getting pretty popular. So we can just save that to our library by dragging and dropping to our folder, and we can find that, select that material, right click, You can see we have an option to add to favorite. So this is a new option in the library, this star tab here. And this allows you to create collections of commonly used resources that you can access all in one location. So if I had a scene, an automotive scene, and I wanted a similar look, each time I created an automotive scene, then I can refer to this favorites collection and just apply this stuff very quickly. Okay, so back to our Fire Iridium. In addition to the ability to add to favorites, you can also upload to KeyShot Cloud. So let's go ahead and do that. The first time you launch KeyShot Cloud from your toolbar, you'll be prompted to create an account or log in. It's totally free to create an account. Just need a valid email address. So now that we're uploading a resource, the name, description, and tags are all required to upload. So we'll call this Fire Iridium and a metal-based material with a color gradient procedural texture. We can query for suggestions, and some commonly used tags will be pulled from the data that we've already inputted. And then we can quickly upload that material, and it's right there for you guys at home to download and use yourself. Okay, so before we go into some new render features, there's a couple other things I want to talk about, and one of these is the Retain Textures and Labels option. So we'll close the cloud for now, and let's go to our Textures tab. And we can find a label, and let's just drag and drop a label onto our carbon fiber here. Okay, so we've created a custom material, we've applied labels to it, but we decide that we want a different material. And we want to use a material that we've already created in our library. But we don't want to replace and reposition all these labels. So now we have a way to make that very easy. You can find a material in your library, and when you drag and drop this into your scene, you can see the option to hold Alt to retain textures or Control to retain labels. So if I hold Control and drag and drop onto my part here, and release, you can see that label is saved and the material has been updated. And speaking of updates, in the color library, the Pantone collection has been updated to its most recent form. So all of these Pantone colors are now up to date. Just like retain labels, we can also use retain texture. So if I wanted to use this metallic black paint, I can drag into my scene, hold Alt to retain textures, and drop it onto this hammered material here, so that texture is retained. So this ability to retain textures and labels helps you work a lot faster when switching out materials and doing color studies and material variations. Okay, so let's say that we're ready to render. We'll click the render button on the toolbar here. to launch our render options dialog. Like I mentioned before, we have a new option for performance, so I can use my real-time settings if I want to render with only 18 cores. But in this case, I'll use all 24 cores. Now, the machine I'm working on is actually a 12-core machine that's been hyper-threaded, so it allows me to use 24 threads, and this makes KeyShot run a little faster and increases your performance. So I highly recommend for those of you at home to take a look at your CPU, your processor, and determine whether it can handle hyper-threading. Then you can just go into the BIOS and turn that on. I'm sure there are some YouTube videos which explain how to do that. So for now, let's just go ahead and render out an image so I can show you the new render output image editor. If we click on the little pencil icon here, we'll bring up our adjustments pane. And what this allows you to do is make adjustments while your image is rendering. So for example, we can add a vignette to our image. We can adjust the saturation. We can make a hue shift to our image, all while it's rendering. And then once the image is complete, you can just save out a variation. And you can continue to make adjustments and continue to save variations until you close the image editor window. Okay, so here we talked about some rendering and workflow enhancements, some things that make KeyShot a little easier and faster to use. Something I didn't mention was the new thumbnails, which I'm sure you've seen here. And what this allows is just a more accurate representation of your material to show material properties, textures, transparency, refraction, reflection, etc. We talked about the updated Pantone colors, the new Favorites tab, which allows you to access collections of commonly used resources. We have the pattern tool and instancing. So instancing updates with live linking and update geometry. Another place instancing is used in KeyShot is with scene sets, which we'll talk about a little later when we talk about more of the pro features. We have some performance enhancements, so the frames per second increase. Also, shadow calculations have become faster, along with material and light source material calculations. So overall, KeyShot is running smoother and faster than it was before. And then we also talked about procedurals, retain textures and labels. We uploaded a material to the cloud. So here in the cloud, we have our thumbnail view showing. We can show in a list view as well. And we can go through the different categories here, very similar to the KeyShot library. When you select a resource, its details are shown here, and giving you the option to like that resource, make comments, download, report, and search by clicking on any of these tags, or you can also search by user by clicking the name here. And then the last thing I showed was the render output image editor, which allows you to make adjustments to your image while you're rendering. Definitely increasing that efficiency and increasing your speed when using KeyShot. Alright, so now that we've talked about these items, let's move on and talk about some of the new animation properties. Okay, so in order to demonstrate some of the new animation features, as well as some of the new Pro features, I'll be using this muscle car scene, which I've already set up with some animations applied. One thing new about the animation workflow in KeyShot 5 is that the properties have now been moved to the timeline as opposed to the scene tab where they were located before. So now there's no need to switch between windows when adjusting your properties and parameters of each of your animations. So you can see here we have one of the new animation types selected, the camera switch event, and this allows you to switch from one camera to another. It's a very simple animation, but can be powerful, especially when used along with other animations such as the new fade animation. So if we scrub through our timeline here, we can see we have a fade animation fading our car out, then our camera switch, and the car fading back in again. So we can preview that to see what the animation looks like. And I can show you guys how I set that up. So let me delete these and go ahead and add them back in again. So the first thing we need to do is fade out our entire assembly. To do that, we'll select that top level model in the scene tree, right click, animation fade, and you can see the properties pull up. We have the fade from 100% to 0, and that's correct. So then starting at 1 second, we'll want to fade the car back in again, and an easy way to do that is just selecting that fade animation we just created, right click and mirror. So now we have the car coming back in, and let's see, at about 3.5 seconds we'll want to fade back out again. We'll shorten the duration of that and do the same thing in mirror. So now we have our car faded out, fading back in, fading out again, and in. So now let's go ahead and add our camera switch event here at the 4-second mark. In order to do that, we'll need at least 2 saved cameras or view sets, and we already have 2 here in the scene tree, as you can see, and both of them have some camera animations already applied. So we're starting with the front camera as our active camera, and at the 4-second mark we'll want to make a camera switch event to the 3/4 camera. So now if we scrub through this, we can see we have our first animation and a transition to our camera switch and our second animation. So the fade animation can be used for transitions like we've done here, but also for, say, part layering visualizations. If we wanted to fade out, say, the body panels and show how this car was constructed, we can easily do that using the same type of technique. So those are the 2 new animation features, the camera switch event and the fade animation. And also, if you are a pro user with animation, you now have the motion blur option. So if you go to your settings tab and enable motion blur, KeyShot will reference all of the animations that you've created. So in this case, I have my wheels rotating here, and that is creating the motion blur effect that you're seeing. We can increase that effect by locating that animation and just increasing the amount of degrees that that wheel is rotating. So at the moment, I recommend using motion blur mostly for still images, such as this one you're seeing here. It can also be used for animations, but I recommend to keep those animations a little more on the simpler side. As you begin to have many movements and more complex animations, the blur becomes a little too much. So just find what works best for you. Okay, so that was motion blur. Let's go on and talk about a couple more pro features. I'll turn motion blur off for now and hide. Well, let's see. Let's scrub back to the beginning of our animation here and hide our timeline. And let's just create a new camera. And I'll show you how to use the match perspective tool. So to do that, we'll need a backplate in our scene. Let's open up the KeyShot Cloud and navigate to the Backplates tab here. And we can find a backplate. One of these would work well. We can download a single resource, or we can use Control on the Windows or Command on the Mac to multi-select and download multiple resources at a time. You can see they're added directly to the Downloads folder located in the respective library tab. And once those are done loading, we can just drag and drop and apply it directly to our scene. Okay, so let's use our Match Perspective tool, which can be found in the Project window in the Environments tab under the Background Accordion. You can select Match Perspective, and you can see we're given some guidelines here, which we can line up to perspective lines in our image to eliminate some of the guesswork setting up your camera and perspective. Now, we have a couple options. We have 2-point perspective, which does not have the vertical y-axis reference lines. The 3-point perspective is a little more accurate if you do have vertical lines in your scene. This helps calculate some of those twist values. So if we go to our camera tab, we can see these values updating as we're positioning our lines in the scene. If we need a little more room to see what's going on in our backplate, we can always dolly out. If we know that we want to see a 3/4 kind of view like this, then we can set our azimuth value here or in the real-time view and then lock the rotation. And now when we move our guidelines, that rotation or azimuth value will be locked in place. So this tool does not necessarily work for every backplate image that you have. It's important that there are some lines, some guidelines in the image that you can align these lines to, but this looks about right. We're given a perspective of 39, and that's our focal length there. Then we can continue to adjust the azimuth or the rotation and select check when we're done. Then we can go ahead and just save that camera, and that's it. Okay, now this environment isn't quite working very well for this scene. So let's go to the Environments tab, select the HDRI Editor, and I'll show you some of the improvements that we've added here. The big one is the sun and sky generator. So you can choose the resolution. The higher the resolution, the higher the quality, but will take longer to generate, so we'll keep it at 2K for now. You can select a location from the drop-down list or type in a custom coordinate location. Select the date and time. And the turbidity is the amount of haze that you're seeing in the sky. We can keep pins if we've already added pins like we have here. Environment settings is referring to the settings you see here in your environment tab. And adjustments are referring to the adjustments here. So let's go ahead and generate that. And then we can rotate our environment around. See, we have a very nice crisp shadow produced by our sunlight. And we still have all the flexibility of the HDRI Editor. So we can go into our adjustments, we can bring down the contrast a little bit, increase the brightness. We can desaturate if we like to, and we can also add pins. So right now we have this dark floor or ground, but in our backplate image here we have this kind of gray, warm concrete. So let's go ahead and add a pin, and we'll change the color using our color picker. We'll select something similar to this ground here, and just place that pin in there. So then we have some warmer tones reflecting in the underside of the car and in the wheels, and just helps more accurately represent the backplate. We have some new blend modes, as well as fall off modes. And we've also added a new image pin. So this allows you to take any type of image here, including high dynamic range images, and using those as pins in your scene. So what I've done is taken an existing HDR into Photoshop and just cropping the image, so all I have is the sun, and I'm using this as an image pin. I can drag it around here in the HDRI editor, or I can use set highlight to position it in a particular spot. Okay, so that's it for the new animation features, as well as motion blur, match backplate, and the HDRI editor updates. So next, let's talk about some more of the advanced pro features, and we'll do that by starting a fresh scene. Alright, so one of my personal favorites for the new Advanced Pro features is the NURBS data import. So I'm going to go ahead and just import my file here. This is an IGES file, but NURBS is available for Creo, CATIA, Inventor, SolidWorks, NX, STEP, IGES, Parasolid, and Alias. So if you are using one of those file types, you'll notice in the import dialog under geometry, you have the option to import NURBS data. And this will allow you to keep the tessellation quality, or the polygon count, pretty low on your part and still render out very high quality smooth images. So right away on import you can see we have some nasty stuff going on here with these surfaces. The tessellation quality is way too low, but if we go to our ribbon and click on the NURBS icon, then in NURBS mode we can see those are perfectly smoothed out for creating a very high quality image. So this allows you to have smaller file size and still high performance. So let's go ahead and just set up this scene, and I can show you how we can use scene sets to set up an entire virtual photo shoot in one scene. So right now in the scene tree you can see we have models, cameras, and scene sets. And what scene sets do is essentially link your cameras or view sets to your scene tree configurations. So we can work in the default scene set and set up our entire scene, and then once we've done that, we'll begin to create some view sets and scene sets. So in this case, I will duplicate one of these pins and maybe rotate it, set up some kind of composition here. Okay, let's open up our library and apply some materials. And I'll just link these, change our environment. Change the background color. And we'll create our view set. And for those of you who aren't aware, a view set saves all your camera position values along with your environment settings. So now this view set will have this background color saved, our environment that we've applied. And we can create now a new scene set. And we'll call this one NURBS and apply the view set we just created. So I want to add some textures to these metal pins. I'm just going to add a bump map here that I've already created. Bring up my coordinate legend to see that that should be projected on the planar X. Reduce our scale a bit. Turn off repeat. And we'll flip that around, reverse the bump height, and position position our label there. Okay. So let's say we wanted to do a rendering with our pin here, our NURBS pin. And then we also wanted to set up a scene set with our poly pin. So I'm just going to work in poly mode because it is a little faster. And you can either create a new scene set based off of the default. So if we make the default scene set active, we can essentially instance what we're seeing here. But in this case, since I've already added this texture that will update with some different text, I'll make my NURBS scene set active and add a new scene set for polys. And I'll apply the same view set, although I could apply a different one if I wanted to. And let's say in this case, I only want to see this one pin. Then we'll just go ahead and hide that, and that state is being recorded in the scene set. So we can switch back to our NURBS scene set and back to polys. Now actually I do want to adjust this camera, so let's do that and create a new view set and select my poly scene set and just assign view set 2. So now we have two different view sets, two different scene tree configurations, and the last thing I want to change is the material. So then I'll just load in this other texture that I've created. There, now that's updated, and we can toggle through our scene sets here, and there we go. Okay, the last thing that I wanted to show you is the 3D print export. So I know that we'll have some issues with this file since the tessellation quality is so low. But if we go to File, Export, we have the option now to export to ZPR or STL. We can go ahead and save that and select subdivision, a model scale, and our units. And we're getting an error message for non-manifold edges, and that's what you're seeing here. So if you do intend to export to 3D print, you should be aware of this while creating your 3D model. You want to make sure that the model is solid and watertight. But the export to 3D print will allow you to take your visualizations to the next level and go from 2D directly into 3D, getting you one step closer to a final product. Okay, so those were the last pro features that I wanted to demonstrate: the NURBS data import, along with the scene sets and the export to 3D print. And then as an outline of what we covered today, we went over the new streamlined user interface, the updates to the interface components, and we've talked about some ways that rendering speed and workflow has improved in KeyShot 5. We looked at some of the new animation features and the new pro features. So thank you all for joining us today,